Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about safety using a refrigeration manifold. So the manifold is what we use to connect to the air conditioning, heat pump unit, whatever refrigeration we are working on with service valves. And so we're going to go over some things that we got to be thinking about, how to not only protect the system, but ourselves as well. So the first thing is always going to be we want to have safety glasses on. When we're working with refrigeration, the pressure on some refrigerants can be very high, and so we're going to be thinking about that. Not uncommon at all for like our 410A refrigerant to be running at over 300 pounds of pressure. So you want to be thinking about that. When you're connected to this unit, you could have 300 pounds of pressure in this hose, and if that hose would burst, that is a lot of pressure coming out. And as we've been learning about the refrigeration system, here we have high pressure liquid refrigerant. So when that refrigerant is coming out and it's hitting this 0 psi atmosphere on the gauge, that is going to drop that temperature significantly of that refrigerant, and it's going to be cold, and it could cause a lot of damage. So even what can happen at times is something in the unit could burst. The unit could be running, or even when it's off, and you could be drilling drilling a screw in, and that could hit the refrigerant lines and cause it to burst. So always be mindful and be thinking, how can I protect my eyes? So other things we want to be thinking about is whenever we're getting our refrigeration manifold out, we want to be looking to make sure that the hoses are the correct hoses, and we don't see any major problems with them. Stuff that we always want to be thinking about is making sure that the gaskets are in there. So if you would unscrew that hose and look down there, you would see a rubber gasket, and that is a very good thing just to be mindful of, that you want to have that gasket, because again, if you didn't have that gasket and you connected this refrigeration manifold to the unit, you're going to get a leak. So, and over time, those gaskets will actually need replaced. So we want to make sure the hoses are in good shape. We got the correct hoses. They're on, the correct placement on the manifold. We're going to put the red hose where the red gauge is, the yellow in the middle, and the blue hose where the blue gauge is. And some other manifolds, they're going to have more hoses at times, but here we just have a 3-hose manifold, and that's fine. So another thing we always want to be mindful of, here at the school, our hoses at this point in time, they have these built in, and what they're called is low loss fittings, or actually low loss, or these ones are actually say seal right. So if you hear low loss or seal right, this is the kind of fitting we're talking about. And what that fitting does is, once you connect to the system and take the hose off, it's going to create a very fast seal. So all that refrigerant that's in the hose, it's not going to come pouring out of the hose and cause, one, we don't want it venting into the atmosphere, and two, we don't want to be hurting ourselves with this refrigerant coming out of the hoses. So we want to do our best. So we always want to make sure when we're connecting our high and low hose to the system, we want to make sure that there is some type of low loss or ball valve that is on the hose. Never try to attach, especially your high pressure line, without a low loss or seal right fitting, because a lot of refrigerant is going to come leaking out of the port, and it could easily freeze or burn you. So you have to be so careful. What can happen and will happen, possibly depending on how long you do this, is these fittings will fail, and when they fail, they do make a rebuild kit. So you could need a new hose, or if you're able to install a rebuild kit, you repair it. But one way or another, you want to make sure that you have either a ball valve or a low loss fitting on your hoses before you connect them to the system. So that's another thing, just be making sure, do I have these low loss fittings? If you ever connect to a system and you find those are leaking, you want to let me as the instructor know, and not be using that, because it needs to be repaired. So that's a big safety thing. But you know, along with like our physical safety, I want to be thinking about the safety and of the unit. Like we want to do our best to protect the unit. We don't want to be damaging the unit or causing harm that is going to affect a customer. And so we're going to be thinking about some more things here. And one of them is, before we ever connect to a system, we want to make sure that our hoses are empty. And so what I typically do is I'll open up my valves and I'll loosen the hoses just to make sure there's nothing in there. Because even when you do everything properly, you're still going to have a little bit of refrigerant that remains in the hose. So we want to make sure that refrigerant gets out of the hose before we go and we hook it onto another system. Now you might ask, well, what's the big deal? Well, here's the big deal. For one, if for some reason you know, you're working on a system before this unit here that we're working on, and it has a different refrigerant in it, and we didn't realize that, or we didn't realize that there's still refrigerant in the hose, and we connected to the system. Well, now we've taken that refrigerant that was on the system before and we put it in this refrigerant. And that can be really bad, especially if it's a totally different refrigerant. But also think about, what if that previous refrigerant was contaminated with acid or something like that, and now we've introduced that into this system as well. What if it wasn't refrigerant at all? What if it was nitrogen? You know, because we use nitrogen in heat HVAC. We use it to do standing pressure tests. We use it to purge when we're brazing. What if that nitrogen's in there? And again, we introduce that into the system. That's not going to be good for the system, and it's going to be a disservice to the customer. So we really want to be mindful, making sure that this is completely empty. So that's what I'll do. I'll just loosen, make sure it's no pressure in the hoses, and then tighten them back up. Now, after we make sure there's nothing in the hoses, we really want to make sure that our gauges are zeroed. Because what can happen, especially even a digital gauge, but even this old one with just a mechanical gauge, is the actual pressure needles can get uncalibrated. And what can happen is, instead of 0 pounds, which I'm not sure how well you can see that here, it may read something else. It could be reading higher, it could be reading lower, but we got to make sure that's zeroed. Well, the question might be, well, what do we do if we don't see it at 0? Well, on a mechanical gauge like this, it's pretty simple. We can, I'm not going to say every mechanical gauge is going to let you do this, but I know that this one does. The reason I say that, because I feel like I've used some like fluid filmed gauges, and I don't know if those could be calibrated. But anytime you're using it, look to see, because these have little plugs on the face of it, and you can take those out and you can actually stick a screwdriver in, and there is a little gold screw, and you can then calibrate it just by turning that. And so you want to turn that back to 0 and make sure both sides are at 0. And see, this side's off a little bit, so I'm going to pull this plug out and I'm going to set it to 0 and put that plug back in. This one's missing the plug, and now we're at 0. And so you might also be thinking, well, what's the big deal if it's a little bit off? Well, it's a big deal because it's going to throw our readings off. And we've talked about, you know, our temperature pressure charts, and how, you know, at certain temperature or pressures, that equals your saturation temperature. But let's say that you're 5 pounds off. I mean, that's going to throw off what your saturation reading is, and that's going to throw off what your actual subcooling and superheat is potentially. So you really want to be thinking about that and just doing a good job, because once your gauges are on, you know, if you miss that it's zeroed, you could end up doing harm instead of good, and that would not be good. So just be mindful of that. So after we made sure that our hoses are in good conditions, we have our low loss fittings on, we've made sure that there's no pressure in the hoses. You know, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shut these. And real quick on a note here, so I'm twisting in to close this, and then if we want to open, we can twist out. And so just remember that, because at least at first it can get kind of confusing. But let's real quick talk about how does this actually work. Well, when we have these closed and we connect our hose to the system, what happens is pressure is going to come down the hose and it's going to actually read on the gauge. But that's the only spot that hose or that refrigerant is going to be. So we can hook up both sides and we can see pressure on the gauge. Well, at times we're going to want to route that refrigerant maybe down our yellow hose or even the red side to the blue side, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's what these handles are for on the side. So these handles, they're going to allow us to open up each side. And so like right here, I opened up the blue side, and that's going to allow refrigerant to go into this block and actually travel down the yellow hose. Pretty cool. So if we wanted to do it to the red, we could do that. We could open it up, and then refrigerant would be allowed to travel into this block down the yellow. So if we opened up both sides, then refrigerant can flow to each side freely. So that's how that works, and that comes in handy. I mean, you need to do that whenever you're charging. You need to have the ability to be able to open this and route refrigerant. You know, sometimes you're charging refrigerant, sometimes you're recovering, or sometimes you're trying to disconnect your gauges, which we're going to talk about, and pull your high pressure into your low side. So we're going to make sure that these are closed, and I think we're about ready to actually connect this to the system. So over the years, what I have really gotten into the habit of is just trying to wear nitrile gloves or some type of glove when I'm connecting the refrigerant hoses to the system, and I'd really strongly encourage that you do the same. So one thing, whenever you'll see, we're going to have to purge a little bit of refrigerant out of the hoses to get rid of the air, but you get a little bit of oil that comes out as well with that refrigerant, and that can get on you. And anytime we can avoid, you know, getting oil and different things on our skin, that's going to be good, because we don't want that absorbing into our body. And you just never know what the long-term effects of stuff like that is. And plus, nitrile gloves, they keep your hands clean. So if you do get oil, you get dirt, no big deal. You can take them off. And if you're touching the customer's things, you're not making a mess. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to take off the service caps here, and we'll get ready to connect our gauges. So always make sure that your system has service caps on it. Like this particular one here in the classroom, it doesn't have a service cap on the low side of the system. And so that is something that we would want to make sure to install, because you might be, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that can leak, and without a cap on it. And if it leaks, then they're going to lose their refrigerant. That's going to be costly to the customer. So we want to be doing our part. So if you're ever on a system like this, you don't see a cap, you definitely want to recommend to the customer to put, you know, a new cap on. Always be looking to, with plastic caps, they got an O-ring in them, and those O-rings are notorious for coming out and you know, a system leaking there. So I got the cap off, and so I'm going to connect the red side to the liquid line service valve. And like I said, I've made sure that these are closed, and I have that hose tight. And be aware that just moving the hose around like I'm doing, that can actually cause this to start to loosen up. So you really want to be mindful of that. So I'm going to start screwing this on, and honestly, sometimes this would be a little bit of a nuisance depending on the angle, and it'd be kind of challenging to actually get that to thread on. But just take your time, make sure you don't cross thread it, and I'm ready to actually finish tightening it all the way. And you might hear the refrigerant start to enter the hose. So you heard that sound, and so that low loss fitting, that is great, and it prevented refrigerant loss, and that hose is completely filled. Now after we get the hose filled, we got to be thinking, because we didn't have any pressure in that before, and now we've added this refrigerant, but there's still a little bit of air. Air is an enemy of the refrigeration system, so we want to make sure to get that air out. And so again, I usually have a rag, not always, but I try to have a rag just to absorb any oil that may come out. And I'm just going to open it up a little bit and purge that air out of that hose. And so that is purged out now. So I'm going to do the same with the low side here. Make sure that hose is tight. And you heard that again. So now that hose is completely filled there. And what we're going to do is I am going to purge this side as well. And so now the air is purged out of that hose. Well, something to be thinking about is, depending on what you're doing with the system, you want to be mindful that you've got the air purged out of these two hoses, but this block here, it still has air in it, and we want to do our best to get that purged out. So what I typically do is I will actually make sure that this is tight, and I will open up the low side of the system, which when it's running, that's going to be the blue side, which is the low side of the system. So open that up, and what that does is it's going to allow refrigerant now. It filled that hose, and I'm going to purge it from the back here. So I purged that. And so now this block, we've put refrigerant into it, and we've allowed that refrigerant to flow completely through this hose, and we purged it out here. So that's good. We want to be doing that. If we just purged it here, then we're not going to get the air that maybe got pushed all the way back here. So I'll purge it at the end of the hose, make sure that air is purged out. So now we are successfully connected to the system. And so how do we get them off? That's the other thing. Well, if we just took those off right now, we're going to have all this refrigerant still stuck in the hose. So I like to do, and this is where I know that you've been taught another way, and I'm going to kind of teach you two ways here today. So let me turn the unit on, and then I'll show you how to take the hoses off. Okay, so we got the system running now, and this is the point we're just going to pretend, hey, it's the end of the job. We need to get these gauges off. And so how do we do it? Well, so I know that some people have learned one way where they've removed the both hoses, and then they've taken the red hose and they put it on the blue side to get it sucked in. And that will get that red hose sucked into the low side, because you got to understand, like, so the red side's your condensing pressure, and so that's a much higher pressure than the low side. But the way that I've traditionally done it, and I still do it, and I've found no problem with it, is I'll actually take the red hose off, and then I'll open up my manifold to suck that refrigerant into the low side. So we've already purged our hoses, we've purged our block, and we purged our yellow hose, and so we can do it this way. So the way I would typically do it, we're all done with the job, I'll take the red side off, and you might have heard a little puff there, very small puff, thanks to that low loss fitting. And so now that is, it's removed from the system. It's not under the system pressure anymore. It still has pressure in the hose. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open the red handled side and the blue, because what that's going to allow this to do is it's going to allow this high pressure refrigerant to flow through the block into the blue side. And it's also going to let any pressure in the yellow that's to flow there as well. So I'm going to open it up. I'm not sure if you can see this, but you'll actually see the blue side go up a little bit, and then they're going to equalize to the low side pressure. So you saw a little jump up. There it is. Now both sides are open, and you can hear it, and you can see it going down. And it's only going to pull in as far as the low side pressure. So it's not going to pull everything in. And I'll go ahead and I'll close this, and I'm going to take the blue side off. Connect my hoses back up. Always be careful. You want to treat your hoses very like china, like very, very delicate. Do not let them get in the dirt, the mud. We're on a school floor here, but when you're out in the field, you're going to be in different elements. So just be so careful, because you do not want to get dirt or anything into your hose ends there that's potentially going to get into the system. I'm going to shut the unit off now, and we'll talk a little bit more. Okay, so we got our hoses off now, and the unit's off. Now you still are going to have a little bit of refrigerant left inside, and there's only really two options that a person can do. One, they could always hook up a recovery machine and try to get the rest of that out, but in the field what you're going to be doing is you're going to be allowing that just to vent. So don't do it towards your face. This is the minimalist loss. You're just always going to have a little bit. And so I have the yellow hose off, I have it pointed away from me. I'm going to open up the blue side, and that was just a small puff. Another small puff, and so now it's completely empty. And so we put them on successfully, taken them off successfully, and always make sure that you put your service caps back on, snug them up a little bit, and call that a job well done. So really get into the practice doing this, because definitely starting out it can be confusing, and you just really want to be careful. Make sure to purge your hoses from air. If you're ever not sure, purge again. Always make sure. You do not want to get air into the system. Make sure your gauges are zeroed. Make sure the gauges are empty before you start and before you zero them. Like if there would be refrigerant or nitrogen or something in those hoses and then you zeroed it before you released it, that's going to throw you off. So just make sure your low losses are working. They're attached to the gauges. Make sure your hoses are good. Make sure you're zeroed, and just be very careful anytime you're working with high pressure refrigerant. Now real quick, I'm just going to show you a digital set of gauges. Definitely more fancy, as you can see. Still going to be 3 hoses. Pay attention here, because this can be confusing. It's different than this set. So you still have the hoses coming out the bottom, but on this one the hoses are attaching to the back, where this one the hoses are attaching to the front. So just be mindful of that, because you don't want to like put the wrong end on the unit. So just be paying attention to that. So the big thing I wanted to show you here is, if you say your gauges, your hoses are empty, but you're still showing pressure, on these they actually have a 0 pressure button, which is pretty cool. You don't have to get a screwdriver out or anything like that to calibrate it. So make sure that you're zeroing the pressure. Also make sure that you're on the right refrigerant. And if you press the up and down button, it will actually cycle through the different refrigerants. So be mindful of that. If you're ever not sure what refrigerant you're working with, take a look at the unit. In this case here, it actually says it on the model and serial number tag. So be looking, making sure. If you're ever working on something and you're not sure, come and let me know if you have a leak or anything like that. You want to protect yourself, but get help. Just never be afraid to ask for help. So hope this was beneficial, and good luck.